Okay, very good morning. It's Monday, the 25th of September. I hope you had a good weekend. Just getting straight down to the details of the briefing and the major news from the weekend, which of course was the German election. We're going to go through that in some detail and discuss a few points on that shortly, but just looking at the charts first of all this morning, and as you can see, we've had a little bit of mild risk off in terms of some of the European assets, that being a bit of weight top left here in the euro currency. You can see at the reopening of electronic trade, we gapped a little lower, having closed around the 120 handle on Friday, and we're trading around 119.70. So it's not the biggest move lower you will have ever seen, but certainly as we're going to discuss with the slightly complexity around forming a coalition, in what form that will take in Germany, is what's just led to a bit of this slight uncertainty in the market. And then also, as we'll discuss, the AfD, which is the right-wing nationalist party, also gaining some pretty big ground as well, has made some a little nervous. But looking elsewhere, gold unfazed by this latest development. We remain slightly negative and still sub, importantly, the $1,300 level to get the week underway. Elsewhere, sterling remaining resilient for the time being, despite the little dip that was seen. Obviously, we were awaiting with great interest that speech from Theresa May at the end of last week. It did weaken after, well, really, it wasn't a great deal of new information that she brought forward. And we're now looking towards this week, where from today negotiations restart for the fourth time now with our European partners to kind of thrash out, as what May was talking about on Friday, this idea of trying to agree upon what's needed to secure a transitional deal for a 2-year period thereafter the expiration of Article 50 in March 2019. So the pound seen a bit of a recovery. Other than that, it's been pretty quiet on the news front for sterling, other than the Labour Party conference is to get underway today. So I'm sure you'll see headlines related to that, but don't be expecting to see much about Brexit, because apparently, if the weekend's press is to be believed, Labour are not even going to talk about Brexit at all, which has received a little bit of a backlash from some members of their own party, given they're ducking one of the bigger issues. But let's see. That's going to commence in Brighton later on today. Elsewhere, the DAX, again, likewise with the euro, a little bit of a gap lower, but I'd say this is a fairly contained repricing on the back of the German election. And I'll discuss a few reasons why shortly. But in the futures, we opened, had an initial push down to really was the Friday's low before seeing a bit of a bounce back. I think it would be unsurprising if this DAX later on this morning was to close the gap on the Friday move and come back up to pivot, because my overall take from this German situation is it's not as bad as maybe some of the sensationalized headlines that you're reading this morning, is my overall take on it. But looking at here on the weekly range then from last week, we're looking down at the kind of 12,500 level, up to what really was the volatility that was seen towards the back end of last week. And we're pretty much sitting a midpoint of that. So I would say there's not great concern that the market's reflecting on the outcome of this German situation, not at least at this point. But certainly near-term levels, we'll be keeping an eye on Friday. Any break of that, then the weekly range low. But at the moment, as I say, I would say the bias probably here is for a gap fill from where we dropped at the futures open this morning. Let's have a look then at the German situation in a bit more detail. So this is the major parties suffering worst ever results as the AfD enters the Bundestag. So Angela Merkel, as expected, has secured her first term as the German Chancellor. Her win, though, has come at the expense of her party's worst actual election result since 1949, and bigger than expected success for her nationalist opponents, the Anti-Immigration Alternative for Germany, or the AfD. So looking at the actual numbers then, the CDU, Merkel's party, CDU-CSU, had 33% of the vote. And what's just easy to see then from this graphical representation is the change since 2013 by percentage point. So you can see here her party losing around 8.5%. So the two kind of mainstream parties which have the biggest representation in the German parliament, that being the CDU and SPD, you can see came out the worst. I would say this has become a fairly familiar pattern amongst other elections that we've seen across Europe and elsewhere, where the kind of more mainstream parties have seen dwindling support, albeit still the most popular, at the expense of some of those voters looking for alternatives. And usually the biggest benefactor, or the biggest beneficiary of that from an opposing party point of view, has been those of a far-right view. As you can see here then, for the AFD, and this was what the papers have kind of jumped on, because obviously it makes very good headline when you start talking about the fact that it's the first kind of far-right representation since the Nazi Party when it comes to Germany in the Bundestag. But they've managed, and this was the surprise, the AfD, to capture 12.6% of the vote. So this, in fact, bigger than the FDP, the Left and the Green. You can see here the AfD gaining almost 8% change, so a significant swing. And if you remember with France, although it ended up being the case that Le Pen fell at the final hurdle in the runoff against Macron, the actual representation though has increased in terms of support, and then that in Parliament. Now, looking at a few other things, I think this is quite interesting, because you quite often read about this demonizing of the far right parties, but I think this is a good representation here of where is this vote for the far right in Germany coming from. One very interesting comment that I heard a pundit say on Bloomberg this morning, who was kind of a political specialist. He was talking about the very fractured nature of the AfD party itself. It's kind of divided into a complete cross-section of two distinct different mindsets. Those of being more moderate and wanting to actively actually seek coalitions with other parties, and those of a much more far-right extreme view on key issues such as immigration and so forth. That being said then, what this chap was suggesting was that to think that the AfD will have any type of power in government, I think is a bit of a stretch, because he said that they can't even actually come together as a party themselves, never mind utilize this kind of leverage that they've managed to garner in this latest result. So I just thought that was quite an interesting take. His view was that actually in the coming weeks and months, while they sort out this composition of a coalition government, actually the AfD will probably break down in itself anyway, because of the arguments internally, because they're not as, in his words, an organised party as some of the others. But this graphic, what's quite interesting here, you've got the 0 on the axis on the left-hand side, and what this is measuring is basically the ones that have gone up. So a positive figure is the gaining of support. So you can see if the AfD have gained some 4 million votes. To the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got the CDU, which is Merkel's party, which has lost over 2 million. But what's interesting here is to see where these other voters have come from in order to contribute to this bigger far-right movement. And you can see here actually the CDU and CSU, so partly some of Angela Merkel's supporters from a few years ago, have now voted into the far right, as too has a smaller proportion of SPD, as has some of the others, and then people who didn't vote at all have emerged probably as the biggest backers of that far-right movement. But what's quite interesting here then is that actually almost a quarter of the new support for the Nationalist Party has actually come from Merkel's party. So again, to think that this far-right extremist view is going to carry precedence in reality, I think, is a little bit of a stretch of the imagination. When you start talking about, as we said, the actual makeup and structure of the party within itself, but then also now the type of supporters that are supporting them, you would imagine that if you've come from supporting Merkel's CDU, CSU, then to now of a slightly more right-leaning view, it's probably unlikely you're going to be more fitting with the moderate than the extremist far-right view, even within that right-leaning party. This is what the actual Bundestag looks like, and this is important because it does actually mark the biggest Bundestag ever in Germany's history. So basically it's gone from a 672-seat chamber elected in 1994 to become the largest ever now of 709. So this is what it looks like in terms of representation of the seats. So you can see the black dots on the right here are the most largest, that being Merkel capturing then a third basically of the vote. The only difference here then is that she doesn't have a majority, so what happens now? Well, she's going to need to now form a coalition. Now this could take lots of different varieties of which this could be done, but the one that's being coined as probably the most likely here is actually the formation of which this graphic is in at the moment. That being here black, yellow and green. And for those who've been following this closely, this of course mimics the Jamaican country flag, and as such this is what this coalition is being termed as, the Jamaican coalition. And this is what we're going to be looking at or looking for going forward. Now this is quite interesting in terms of a visual history of the Bundestag. So before we get on to the talk about the potential coalitions, there is going to be a bit of time before this obviously gets sorted, and this does add a little bit of short-term negativity, I'd say, to market sentiment. Hence the reason why the euro is probably a little softer this morning, is that, as you can see here, rather than if we were to go back to really post-World War II times, going through late 1940s, 50s, this is when you had a pretty clean CDU, CSU-led coalition, then SPD-led coalitions. The kind of simple way to look at this is the lesser number of parties involved, the more straightforward then the debate that can happen and the country can be governed. As you can see though, over time this process has become more fractured up until this modern day, 2017, where you can see now we've got a split between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different parties. So it's very interesting to see that, you know, there's a much higher breakdown into people's different view represented in the public at the present point in time. One interesting thing then to look at is the Jamaican, then the black, yellow, green parties. This would be the CDU, the FDP and the Green Party. This is a graphic that I shared with you guys last week, and this was looking at all of the different major kind of issues that are facing a political party in Germany at present. And this is how they agree and don't agree in terms of least and most effective scores on these different policy issues. And as you can see then, one of the most actually effective coalitions would be if Merkel was to team up with her main opposition, the SPD. The only problem with this, of course, is that the SPD is stuck to their pledge to go into opposition, which is forcing then this next option, which is most likely, which is the Jamaican coalition. So you can see here, comparative to if we were to get the CDU and the CSU going it alone without the backing of the Greens, then you can see that we start to get a bit of a positive for economic policies, but less so on some of the others, such as immigration, the budget, and so forth. Hence the reason why that seems the most effective coalition. To give you a bit of background, the Greens are actually the most likely to appeal to Germany's conservative centre, or at least a party least likely to disturb their centre-right pro-business plans, since its traditional electorate does not comprise of working class voters. I think that's pretty true for probably most countries. People who vote green tend to be more middle class, not working class. Though it's never made a national government, Jamaican coalitions have actually governed in one state in Germany before, this being in Saarland from 2009 to 2012, as well as a number of local district councils. So it has happened, and so I would say this is why the market is fairly comfortable at this point, and there hasn't been a big sell-off or uncertainty, because I think it's pretty much a high probability that this coalition will go through. It's just a matter of thrashing out some of the details. And obviously this is when you get those lesser parties, the FDP and the Greens, will look to leverage their position, knowing full well that Merkel needs to make some concessions to get them on board. So just going back to the charts here, just even as I've been speaking the last 10-15 minutes, as expected here, the DAX back to pivot, closed the gap. So as I was saying, the market's fairly comfortable with this situation as it's developing. Not only that, with the DAX, if the euro does continue to weaken, this also starts to help as well in terms of some of the export names. So we've got S2 now in sight, 119.48. This in combination with the more kind of hawkish interpretation of the Fed last week. If you remember that big sell-off here, the big candlestick you can see in the center of this euro chart. So obviously as well, this will also be a positive factor in terms of the ECB looking to try and manage this currency up around 120, being a little bit more excessive in their minds. Okay, moving on from the situation of Germany, let's look at a few other things that have come out in the press at the weekend. This is kind of a bigger thing to look out for this week. This is Donald Trump and corporate tax. And the situation, I'd say, really hasn't progressed an awful lot. This is because Republican tax negotiators are targeting a corporate tax rate of 20%, according to two people familiar with the matter at the weekend. Trump is planning a trip to Indiana in the US on Wednesday for a speech on tax issues, according to a person familiar with the matter. So it's going to be midweek when we're looking out for this. Now, they're basically reading between the lines. There seems to be a bit of a coordinated move amongst the people behind the scenes of a more senior nature, that 20% seems to be a more realistic target. The only one person that's causing an issue here is the president himself, who is still kind of pushing himself toward an angling of 15%. So is this going to move the market? I don't know. I think it's lost a lot of its momentum as an issue. I think the whole failure, if you like, to repeal Obamacare has kind of taken some of the sting out of Trump's impact to push through policies. And I think, if anything, people have kind of started to price in the fact that any corporate tax deal, if there is going to be one, is going to take an awful long time, and then two, you're likely to be disappointed anyway. 15% really is not going to happen. I think that's a low probability. If there is going to be a corporate tax deal, it is going to be something more akin to this 20%. It seems to be more the consensus at the moment. So I don't think you're really going to get this big catalyst midweek, but certainly it keeps market supported equity-wise up at around these near all-time high valuations, you would think, the more that they can keep providing new details and content on this issue. But I wouldn't be expecting anything concrete, just more discussions at this point in terms of this week. Overnight, you've had some news as well pertaining to Japan. There's been a couple of headlines that just came out a few hours ago. Japanese PM Abe said he intends to dissolve the lower house. Tells coalition partner he'll call a snap election. Understood election will be held on October 22nd is what the press are reporting this morning. This has not caused a reaction in the market because this is to be expected. But other things that have happened, there have been more positive. Japan, Shinzo Abe ordering his cabinet to compile a new economic stimulus measures, a package worth around 2 trillion yen by the end of the year. Japan government keeps a moderately upbeat view on the economy in September in their latest economic report. And Japan manufacturing PMI has bounced back, being the highest reading since May, as output, new orders and new export orders increased at a faster pace amid strengthening business confidence. So economic data, a little bit more clarity, if you like, the lack of credible opposition in Japan, strengthening Abe's hand, continuity that's likely to lead to in terms of governing the country has turned quite a positive stance now in terms of short-term, medium-term view of the situation economically and politically in Japan. Things are looking more positive now. Just wrapping things up then, looking at the calendar, we do have coming up in the next 5 minutes, so I'll look to try and wrap things up pretty quickly here. You've got German IFO coming out shortly. German IFO, one of the main economic data points from Germany. If you remember, ZEW we had last week was a pretty strong number. Analysts and economists still remaining pretty upbeat because of the relative low risk surrounding the German election. And so, as I was saying, despite the worst result for Merkel since basically the Second World War, she still accumulated 33% of the vote. She'll still look to do a Jamaican coalition, so it's still relatively positive. And as I said, the national right representation, yes, it's the first time since the Nazi Party were in place since the war, but they're going to have little power actually to influence government. So I would be expecting IFO still to remain relatively positive. This number has been tracking up at around the 116 handle consecutive really for 3 months in a row, and I'm expecting very little to differ from that in the numbers shortly. That's pretty much it though in terms of data from the day, but there are an incredible amount of speakers, so you've got to be on guard. You've got 10:15 all the way through the afternoon. It's littered with ECB and Fed speakers, including the President Mario Draghi giving introductory statement at a European Parliament hearing at 2 o'clock. So that's central bankers. Then if we start looking at the week in its composition, today is also the 4th round of Brexit talks which commences. So look out for David Davis and Michel Barnier. And then you've got the Labour Party conference as well. So quite a lot of speakers is really got to be flexible to react to that as it develops. But in terms of Brexit talks, I wouldn't be expecting any concrete progress today, but it will be interesting in the context of what they have to say in the wake of May's comments on Friday. Moving quickly forward through the week, Tuesday is relatively quiet, but again a lot of speakers. Speakers really are a prevalent theme throughout the week. You've got Mark Carney on Thursday and Friday as well, the Bank of England governor. US durable goods Wednesday, then you've got US GDP on Thursday alongside core PCE, more speakers. Friday then you've got Chinese manufacturing PMI, UK GDP, Eurozone inflation, US PCE, Chicago PMI. It's quite a busy week actually, so we're back into the full swing of things after the kind of summer break as we come towards the end of September now. So that's pretty much it. Going to come off the mic, let you guys trade IFO because it's coming out momentarily, so keep a close eye on that. And then any questions, of course, just let me know in the chat room. Okay, guys? Have a good session and a good week ahead. Thank you very much.